Hi everyone, I'm Lori Frank from Lorifrankmediation and Consulting. And every once in a while, when time permits, I love to get on here and do a video or two on a topic that I think will be interesting to you. And today, I'm lucky enough to have a guest, which I love doing because obviously I don't know everything. And I love to bring on people who have really great ideas and insights. And so today I have with me Jill McPherson. And Jill's joining us from Ontario. So through the magic of technology, we're able to get together here today. So welcome, Jill. Thank you for joining me for this.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking.
Yeah. So I've known Jill before kindergarten. Yeah, we've known a long time, and off and on through the years, our paths in life cross here and there, and so sometimes we might not talk to each other for a long time, and then all of a sudden something connects us again. And so recently I was reading one of Jill's blogs and really thought the topic would be of interest to people that I'm working with. So, but before we get into that, I want to let Jill do a little intro here. And Jill, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks, Lori. I have a variety of hats and things I get involved in or are involved in presently. As you mentioned, you read my blog, so I am a blogger. I also do speaking events around the topic of, self-empowerment and change your thoughts, change your life, that kind of theme. And that all started from my interest in healing when I had several years ago, I was born with some joint issues, and several years ago I had both my hips replaced. And in the journey of those hip replacements, I looked at other ways to heal beyond our sort of traditional surgery, painkillers, physio, and carry on. And when I opened myself up to that, there was a whole bunch of people and books and resources and workshops suddenly across my path. And all of that led to me finding a strong passion in wanting to share all this information that I had come across in my own healing journey, which led to me doing some TV shows. I was approached by a local producer to do a show called Awakening Within, and where I interviewed people who helped with any sort of modality of healing, anything that could help viewers with getting unstuck in any area of their life. So that ran for a few seasons, and then more recently I was working with somebody down in Mississauga who we again did another version of Awakening Within that was aired on Hamilton CHCH. And now I'm working on building more of an online presence, because that's where TV is evolving, is to online. So that's another thing I'm working. And in between all of that, I still teach part-time. I teach music, drama, and mindfulness to kindergarten to grade 3s, and also busy with 4 kids, a husband, and a farm. So, so lots of fun things on the go.
Yeah. I always, anytime I see your Facebook or those kinds of things, you've always got something on the go, especially with running a farm. And then you both work outside the home, and you've got kids. So it's a lot going on. But always interesting stuff, it seems.
Yeah. I always say people, most days it's a fun busy. So the odd time, we all have those days, but most days, it's fun.
Whenever people ask me if I'm busy, I try to say, instead of saying I'm so busy, I try to say life is full.
I like that one. I'll keep that one.
So originally, when I reached out to you, it was because I'd read one of your blogs. And the general theme of that particular blog was about making assumptions. And I know in the work that I do, So I'm often in mediation, I'm working with people who are separating. Sometimes I'm doing workplace stuff. So it's all around people who are interacting in a variety of ways. And there's a conflict that's come up. And so we're working through trying to resolve that conflict. So whether it's working through the issues of their separation, or I'm working with teams in a workplace, working through staff conflict, those kinds of things. Something that is across the board for all of us in my own life and in my work life that I see other people, we make assumptions on a regular basis all day long. Mm-hmm. And when you and I were chatting before, we were saying it's just part of the human condition, right? We do that. Mm-hmm. We make assumptions. We think we know what other people are thinking. We think that we understand why they're behaving in a particular way. But as you pointed out in your blog, when you become more aware of these assumptions, you suddenly realize that maybe they were incorrect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I take out maybe. I always take out maybe, maybe I'm, making an assumption, or maybe they're incorrect. It's like almost always our assumptions are incorrect. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the circumstance in that particular blog that you wrote about.
Sure. Yeah. It was my blogs. First of all, when I write something, it's always just from, I've had some sort of profound aha moment or epiphany, and I'm like, oh, this is good. And because that self-awareness helps me, then I like to write about it. So it can be almost any topic under the sun. But this one in particular I was doing a speaking event for a women's group, community group. And it was in a city where, the demographics have changed quite a bit in the last 10, 20 years, in particular, last 10, and suddenly there's been an influx of immigration. So different ethnic groups, different religious practices, and really making a change to this originally predominantly white Christian-based city. Mm-hmm. And so these women are all in the retirement age, and they were struggling with the change. And so the woman who booked me thought my talk would be helpful in them accepting and understanding, their neighbors, so to speak. And so when I share, because I participated in, one of my passions is participating in different religious ceremonies. In fact, I've done several retreats and gone to several events where I actually go into different places of worships, different, temples and of different faiths, and actually participate in ceremonies. And that's, very profound. So I've created a slideshow to show some of the pictures and some of the experiences I've had. But it can still be a touchy subject for some, because some people think they already understand these religions. They already have decided that they don't like or don't agree with or whatever. So my talk is called Agreement versus Acceptance. And so I really help people to understand that the goal isn't about agreement. It's just hearing and being able to accept, not from agreement, but just to accept, so that's how they feed themselves spiritually. But it can charge some people still. So when I was speaking to this group, there was one lady in particular who appeared to me out of the corner of my eye to be constantly rolling her eyes on things I said. And I found it a little bit, distracting and intimidating to a certain degree, because I was like, oh, she doesn't believe me, or she's having a problem with this. Clearly she doesn't agree. And so all of these thoughts are kind of distracting me during my talk. And anyway, so then when the talk was done, I thought I must make a point of going over to speak to her. I do try to get to anybody who I feel they're struggling after a talk. Not that happens very often, but I do like to make a point of talking to them after. And she ended up approaching me right away and just telling me how lovely the talk was and how informative, and that really helped her, and what a great speaker I was, and all this stuff. And I was shocked, because I was thinking, wow, that's not what I was thinking you were thinking at all. Yeah. And so as I was walking up to the parking lot, it just really hit me of how often does this happen in our daily life? If she hadn't come up to speak to me, because I was running out of time and it was looking like I wasn't going to get a chance to speak to her. So if she hadn't sort of tracked me down, I would have left that event thinking about this woman being upset with me and having all these assumptions over what she was thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended up being that, there must have been something else that was creating those facial expressions for her, but it clearly wasn't what I was saying. And so then I thought, how often does this happen where we walk away from any sort of communication or interaction with another human being where we've decided how they received our information? And how we often, create pain around that. And I have found that if I've ever had pain around making assumptions about communicating with somebody, if I'm brave enough to investigate it and go forth and say to them, hey, this is what I'm wondering, I'm sensing, or I'm interpreting from what you've said or done, I find like 9 times out of 10, their interpretation or their story isn't nearly as painful as the story I have.
Right.
So I create a story far worse than the story that when they finally say, well, this is what was happening for me. And then I'm always relieved that I checked that out.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I, mainly wanted to share. That was sort of the first message in it. And then the second message, realizing that, thanks to other people like Byron Katie and Wayne Dyer and some other of my favorite authors, they've helped me to realize that if you really want to investigate that further, you can start to question over what filter was I looking through when I looked at that woman to interpret her that way, to make that assumption. Mm-hmm. And what you end up finding out is any of your painful assumptions are far more about stories you have about yourself that other person is simply mirroring back. So then when I questioned it, I was like, is it possible that I was having self-doubt about my ability to communicate this information, my, level of expertise, and was I, worried about it and then unconsciously projecting that out to somebody? And I had to say yes. When I really sat with it, I was like, did I have fear around being misinterpreted did I have fear somebody thinking I wasn't qualified enough to speak about this? And it ended up I did. And so I was seeing her through that filter of mm-hmm. my own painful beliefs that I struggle with about myself.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I find the clients I'm working with, of course, because there's a conflict happening, there's a ton of assumptions wrapped into all of that conflict that they've made about each other and about the situation and each other's behavior. So we're really in mediation working through all of those assumptions, trying to identify them and dispel them and get down to what people were really intending or really meant when they said or did something. But I find even for myself as the mediator, I have to be aware and keep that in check the whole time as I'm listening to people, exactly like you said, thinking about what lens I might be looking at them through, because maybe they've reminded me of something, or I've had a similar situation. And so I'm constantly having to be aware of my own assumptions throughout mediation. And like you said, just continuing to be curious, right? Continuing to ask those questions to see if you're on the right path or not with your thoughts and with where things are going. So it can be, it's a lot of work at times. Always trying to go, am I making big assumptions here? Or, but I find it's worthwhile and it's valuable because it really helps you to avoid some of that potential conflict or heading down the wrong road with something.
Yeah. And something that just came up for me when we were talking is another person I also love is Brene Brown. And she talks about vulnerability. She's kind of now become the queen of vulnerability, or their expertise in that. And in her video, it's actually on Netflix, called A Courage. And in her book as well, she explains a story about that her research shows that one of the best ways people can sort of break down those walls of assumptions is they use an expression or a phrase at the beginning of every sentence that says, if you're checking out an assumption, for example, if you say to somebody, so the story I'm telling myself right now is, And then,
I like that.
because that is really what's happening when you're making an assumption, you've created a story in your head, how you interpreted the time and space you shared with that person. And so if you start that, it also helps the person listening to not hear that I'm projecting blame. So if I'm confessing I felt uncomfortable, and if I say something like, well, the story I'm telling myself right now is that you don't think that I'm actually capable of being an expert on this, then they can hear it better because they hear my ownership of the story. Because it is my story. It is a story that I've created in my head. And I'm checking out my story with you, rather than saying, you upset me because you don't think I'm, authentic, or you don't think I, have the qualifications, right? So that's projecting blame, and then they're going to feel the attack. But if you can say it from the story I'm telling myself right now is, and I found that phrase has really helped me in my relationship with my husband too. I'm finding he's much better able to hear me, because I start off by confessing. He knows now, like, I'll refer to it as, so the painful story I have in my head right now about this is, and then he just listens to it as an observer of my story rather than the creator of my story, because he's not responsible for the story or the assumptions I made in my head. That's mine.
Yeah.
Right. So, and when we own it, it just makes us so much more empowered when we can realize that we make our assumptions, and therefore we've created the emotions that come with believing that painful story.
Yeah.
Right. So in fact, like in my blog, the woman, we would tend to say, well, she really upset me with those facial expressions. Well, actually, she couldn't upset me if she tried. My interpretation of her facial expressions is what upset me. So she was just the trigger, but not the cause.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting. I think going back to like your husband or other people in your life that you might say that to, the story I'm creating right now, or that I'm thinking right now, also gives them information, right? So the more you're able to do that with each other, it gives the other person information that, oh, when I do this, or when I talk this way, or when I say these things, Jill's told me in the past how she interprets those. And so it gives them information about their own way of being with you and the way they're interacting with you. And it might make them think about different ways of interacting with you that don't trigger those same thoughts, because they didn't intend it to be that way.
Right.
And so you might think, well, how can I do it differently so that my actual intention comes across?
Yeah. That's good. That's good feedback for the other person, for sure. And the other thing that I just want to really share, a really important resource that I've come across with communication around, well, just around better communication in general, but in dealing with assumptions, and in particularly in your field where you're trying to help, two people or a group of people, two groups, parties, communicate more effectively. Since I came across last year, Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, huge help. And not only for communicating with others, but being more aware of how I communicate with myself. And that's where it really starts, because however you're communicating outward is just a reflection of how you communicate inward, right? And so, but the main thing that in sort of a fairly simple, he gets into a lot of stuff in his book, but in a really simple level, he talks about, when somebody is upset, whether it's yourself or somebody else, and of course you're dealing with people who are upset if they're coming to you for support in mediation. And if somebody's upset, it's simply because of an unmet need. So any sort of negative emotion that we're experiencing comes from an unmet need. And so when we can recognize that in ourselves, so if you're feeling any sort of negative emotion, you can stop and start thinking about, what's my unmet need here? But also then you can do that for the other person, so that if they're upset, rather than listening to their story and sort of getting involved into the complexities or the drama of the story, if you can just use that story as a way, as a red flag saying, okay, there's an unmet need here, and get curious. over what is their unmet need that's creating this upset in them. And when you can listen to somebody from that space, it's challenging, particularly if their upset story involves you, because as humans, we go right into like defensive mode of like trying to prove our innocence or their guilt or both. And I've noticed though that by taking a deep breath and just thinking, okay, so what is this person's unmet need? And often, and especially with myself, when I'm upset or feeling triggered, what's my unmet need? And to give your viewers an example, I've been taking actually some training from a woman who was trained by Marshall Rosenberg. He has since passed, but she did training with Marshall, and she created these lovely sheets that has a list of feelings. They're also listed in Marshall's book, but I kind of keep these handy resources nearby. And so this sheet, for example, the yellow highlights are the happy ones, and then the plain white ones are the negative feelings. And then first identifying what you're feeling, and then there's a whole list of needs here that you'd be like, oh, and when you go through them, you realize that often there's some sort of like unmet need about, to be understood, maybe for information, for comfort, for acceptance. Sometimes it's about excitement. So sometimes drama can happen over just a pure need of excitement, of choice. I get that a lot with students. I find a lot of students at school are upset because of their unmet need to have choice. Right. And so things like that. And of course, even physical survival. There's people will do uncomfortable things in order to make sure their need for safety or shelter is met, or need for under spirituality, for inspiration, and when you start to look at some of these things, you realize, wow, recognition, respect, support, it really helps you to recognize what is either my unmet need or the other person's unmet need. And in the process, that from that space, then you can move forward into more effective problem solving, because you're not getting into trying to solve the story. You're getting into trying to meet the unmet need, which can be met in various ways, regardless of the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Because we spend so much time exhausting trying to be fair or to mediate a story, when the story is just an indicator that there's an unmet need. I totally agree with you. Really, ultimately, we're all just people moving through this world trying to get our needs met. And sometimes we're better at it than we are other times, right? And I find that when I'm working with people, that's exactly what I'm doing with them, is honing in on the need and really encouraging them. Because often people come in thinking they already know the solution to the problem, right? They've got that story, and if I want to fix my story, here's the outcome I need in order to fix that story. But like you said, if we get more down into needs, I really encourage them to put their outcomes aside, what they feel the outcome should be. And we instead focus on needs and kind of take sort of start listing sometimes even the needs. Our solution needs to meet these needs. And then it's so interesting sometimes the solutions people will come up with that they hadn't even thought of before, because they've opened themselves up to the idea that there's more than one way to do this, and that it's not that I'm just trying to solve this very specific story, that instead I've got some needs that I'm trying to meet here within this solution. So when I can get people to sort of flip that switch and think about it from that other perspective, it's really interesting sometimes what people will come up with, things they never thought of before. And they also, I think, like you said, they see the other person in a different way. When they can start to recognize that other person has unmet needs as well. And not take responsibility for that, but to work together to identify them and figure out, well, now what? Right. And often even in the recognition of somebody's unmet need, there is no solution per se or action required. If, for instance, you hear that the other person's unmet need is appreciation, and then you realize, oh wow, like you didn't realize, like I really do appreciate everything that you've done, and I recognize that you have done blah blah, and I really appreciate that. If in expressing that, the other person can get their need met in that moment, and so now the issue over sort of tit for tat or scorekeeping, just washes away on its own. Like it takes care of itself, and now there's no sort of even plan action required, because they got their need met purely from just being recognized or appreciated. And so that's really powerful, how those issues will often just melt away.
Yeah.
So
when we were chatting before, you were talking about, so you're doing the training and that kind of thing, and it was interesting to hear how you've been working it into your everyday life and working it into the way that you interact with students. And so tell us a little bit about that, how you're doing that, and maybe sort of how that has changed your interactions with the people around you.
Well, like I said earlier, it's been huge with my husband and helpful definitely with my 4 kids. I have 3 teenagers and a 12-year-old. So communication is key in this phase of their life. I mean, it's huge. I mean, I'm done with like bath time and diaper changes. And that didn't require really any mental work at all. But this phase in their life is an enormous time for me to be grounded in myself and recognizing when they're upset, what's the unmet need, rather than getting defensive or attacking back, which of course I, still catch myself doing. I'm still human, but having this tool is just another resource. And then as far as at school, it's been even easier to use at school because we don't have that added emotion of like mom or spouse that's pretty intense. But when it's somebody else's kids or somebody else at work where you just have that emotional disengagement a little bit, it makes it easier to apply. And so, for instance, I've had a grade 3 student who wanted, he keeps kind of acting up and acting silly during music class. And I pulled him aside, and one of my teaching colleagues who's also doing this training with me created a sort of a simplified version of these sheets I showed you. And I said to him, like, so, what are you feeling during that time? What would you say? And he like looked for a feeling. And then, I said, what I'm hoping you realize is that there's an unmet need here, and I don't know what your unmet need is, and I'm wondering if you can help me. So he looked through the simplified list we had, and he right away pointed to the word understanding. And so I was like, oh, so what is it that you feel you need understanding around? And he needed understanding that most days music just wasn't his thing, that he didn't really enjoy the class. And so I was able to listen for his need. And if I wasn't, I would have taken it personally, probably got a little bit, well, like, I'm sorry, but you have to do music and it's good for you. And, and get into all the stats about brain development and music. And, or how it'll change your life, and it makes my life better too. So it'll make yours, of course, because whatever's working for me should work for you. And so instead of inflicting that kind of teacher guilt thing that I've heard myself and many other colleagues do with students, I didn't take it personally at all. And so I kept asking questions for clarification. And then I said to him afterwards, because the other thing that Marshall Rosenberg really talks about that's sort of hard for us to do as well as humans is to check in to see if you got it. So that's another phase of like, so what I'm hearing you say is you have this need for understanding that, you don't really enjoy music class, and here's the reasons why, this is what I heard, and then have I got that? Did I get that? And he said, and he sort of like, yeah, he thought that I sort of was starting to get it. That was sort of how he phrased it. I think you're starting to get it. And I laughed because I felt the exact same, because I was still feeling a little bit lost. And I was like, I think you're right. I think I'm just starting to hear you now. Like, I think I'm getting this. And so it was just interesting to see his whole even physiology change when he heard an adult take the time to listen to his unmet need. And so we talked then about like what, how we could handle it when he's in the situation again. When I come back from music, how could we handle that? So how could his needs be met? And so, that's the thing. It's not about like making excuses, or because at the start, I think some people might think it's like, people kind of getting away with stuff, or kind of a way to kind of step issues. And it's not that at all. And it's just realizing that the only way anyone can effectively use nonviolent communication, whether it's adult to adult or adult to child, is you need to see each other as equals. So as a teacher and student, we tend to perceive ourselves as teacher-student, right? Yeah. And yes, I am the adult, and yes, I know more in the sense of information, maybe, and I am in charge of the students in class. So it's not about, okay, we're all going to be just best buddies and be on the same playing field. There still is my responsibility as the leader. But if as a leader you can see yourself as equally human to the person you're speaking to, whether they have less expertise or more expertise in whatever you're communicating about, if you can see them as human, then you can use nonviolent communication. But if you need to have this feeling of like superiority, inferiority, nonviolent communication just sort of looks like a disaster, like an accident waiting to happen, like, because you will feel like you're losing control. But control is not the goal. Respect is the goal, love and respect. And can we all get our needs met? Because I end up sharing with the student my needs, so that he understood this is like, I have a need to teach. I have a need to, and I talked about my needs, so that how can then we work together to ensure that our needs are met, so that we're not, kind of interfering. So it was good for him then to, I asked, can you let me know what you heard me say, so that I feel like I've communicated effectively to you, and so not from a place of like, now, what did I say? It was just checking in. So I'm not sure if I said that clearly, can you let me know what you heard? And he was able to, share back what my needs were. Yeah. And so also creating that level of empathy is huge too, is being able to hear, oh, so you have needs too. And then how can we work together to equally meet each other's needs, or how can I be at least empathetic to it? I mean, ultimately, Marshall talks about that it's our job to meet our own needs, so we not to be dependent on the other person, but to communicate is our responsibility, of what's happening for us. And then notice that often in the communication itself, somewhere in that, in somebody listening and truly hearing, a need is met. Yeah.
It's interesting. I want to come back around to something you mentioned a little bit earlier. You talked about how sometimes still you feel that defensiveness, and maybe you react in that way with your kids or those kinds of things. I always find it interesting. I think sometimes when people listen to others talk about a new way of doing something or what they're working on, that there's some goal in there of perfection or doing this perfectly all the time. When I tell people what I do, they think, that must be so hard. You must be such a good communicator. And I probably am. I mean, I have to be in order to do this, but by no means am I perfect, right? And certainly I make mistakes as well. And so I think it's important for people to hear throughout all of this that it's not that you're trying to reach some level of perfection in your communication. It's around practice, awareness and practice, right?
Right.
And being aware that when things go awry, just being aware of it, and going, that didn't quite work out the way I had hoped, that conversation or that interaction. And then coming back around to it. And I think that's the thing sometimes people forget is when you have those moments where things didn't go as well as you'd hoped, you can come back around to it. And I do that myself. I'll come back around and go, I just wanted to talk about our conversation the other day because I don't think it went very well, and I've had some time to think about it, and I'm wondering if you'd be open to talking about it again. And then you've had that time to think about all the things we've talked about today, the lens that you're wearing, the assumptions that you made, the words that you chose, the lack of curiosity maybe that you had. So it's an ongoing practice in life, right? It's a process.
For sure.
So if you can make those little changes, you've probably found the same. It kind of snowballs over time, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Any skill building is huge, and I can see evidence of it because I'll be sometimes in a situation where I'll think, just a few years ago, this situation would have really upset me. This would have put me either overwhelmed. I would have lost sleep. I would have been, trying to figure out how to solve or fix that other person. And now I have the skill to come back and go, oh, so I'm triggered right now. And then turn to sort of these toolbox of skills of like, oh, so for instance, like what's my unmet need, or what assumptions am I making, or and bringing it back to ourselves, not to self-sabotage, but to be more self-empowered. Right? Because when we realize that what we're experiencing is because of our thinking around something that happened, around a trigger. So when someone says something, it's not the cause, it's the trigger. And then our interpretation is what causes the feeling and the emotion and the upset that comes with it. And so if we can come back to that and go, okay, now you bring it back to yourself, now you're empowered. And if you don't, then you spend your life being a victim to other people's stuff, to other people's behaviors and, ignorance around a topic or whatever, the case may be. And, I always say then, if you're waiting around for everyone to get their act together for you to be happy, you're going to be waiting a long time. So it's really having compassion for yourself, and then when you can do that, you can give compassion to other people. So now if I see somebody else upset, rather than judging them for like, well, they shouldn't be upset, like the way I would have judged myself, then I can kind of go, oh, after I've expressed compassion to myself, I can give compassion to them of like, oh, they must be thinking something really painful to be, or assuming something, or believing something really painful in order to be behaving that way or experiencing that feeling. And more from a observation rather than a needing to get in there and fix or take ownership or blame, and not projecting blame to anybody else, but just having those skills to come back and go, okay, I'm the one who created the upset for myself, so I'm the one who then can change that.
Well, I have a feeling you and I could probably chat about this all day because we just find it so interesting. And I know, I've already, just in talking to you, have learned even more and have some new ideas of areas I'd like to explore in my own skill development. So thank you for that. Well, and even in talking to you right now, I've realized that an email from last night that upset me, I've been able to identify, I was even caught into thinking it was the other person. And in our conversation, it's reminded me to go back and look at, now when we get off this, interview, I'm going to go back and go, why was I feeling that way? What was my unmet need in that email that, was the email that triggered me? Oh, that's great.
So so it's an ongoing process.
Absolutely. And I like I said, with the practice, the more you practice, the more it starts to come to you a little more easily. At first, I think identifying those needs can be difficult, but with practice, it's for sure. Like at first you can stay, upset for a really long time, and then over time, the upset is a shorter amount of time and shorter amount of time because you're like, wait a second, I know something about this. I've got a skill here. I can open my toolbox and investigate this, or I can stay upset. I mean, you're allowed to do that too. That doesn't sound fun.
I don't recommend it.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciated this. I think that you've given us a lot to think about and a lot to go explore. And with that in mind, if people want to connect with you or read your articles, read your blogs, learn more about what you're doing or work with you, where can they go to do that?
They can just go to jillmcpherson.com.
Okay.
And check out my website. I'm also obviously on social media as well. Facebook, Jill Ireland McPherson is my name on Facebook. And also I have a page, Awakening Within, on Facebook as well. But yeah, just go to jillmcpherson.com and all of my information's there, and feel free to contact me for any other information.
Great. And for those of you who are watching, if you go just below the video, I will list all of those resources for you as well. And Jill, maybe you can send me some of the people you've mentioned today,
Sure.
some of the people that you go to for inspiration, and we can list those as well for people to go check out.
Yeah, great. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. Well, thanks.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for watching, and feel free to get in touch with either of us, email, leave comments below the video. We're happy to connect with you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Bye.
Bye.